towards the same thing enough so that we can communicate. But I wouldn't like it at all if each of you didn't bring something to bear on the discussion that I'm incapable of bringing to bear on it.
So the last thing I want to bring up is, of course, I mean, people are going to say I'm Jesus smuggling, but that's the reason, one of the reasons, or where we can understand that in Christianity the Trinity is seen as the infinite, is the image of the infinite that we have is a contradictory possibility of absolute unity and absolute multiplicity. And so we just throw those two up at the same time, and we say the infinite is absolutely multiple and absolutely one, and you cannot, without contradiction, and you cannot totally, you can't reconcile that completely, because that is ultimately it's a problem which fractally appears everywhere anyways, because everything in the world has something in common with everything else. Yes. Whether if it's just being itself. But it also necessarily, it must be different for the difference to
There's stronger
manifest
arguments.
itself.
There's Goodman argument. Every object is infinitely similar and infinitely similar to every
which
other.
is a restatement of the problem of perception itself.
Yes.
It's like, well, you've seen a glass, yes, but you haven't seen this glass. Well, how much difference is there? Well, there's an infinite number of differences, as it turns out. All right, so this is quite a switch here, and I think this is a radical proposition. Maybe not. Because once you hear it, you think, well, yes. And then you think, well, that's self-evident. It's like, yeah, well, not so quick here. The description of a structure of values or an ethic, subject to the codicils that we've already added, or set of priorities is a narrative. So the description of a system of perceptual prioritizations and actions is a narrative. What do you think? It could also be representation in image. It wouldn't have to be a verbal description.
No, I grant that.
Imagistic or verbal description. That is what we regard as a narrative.
So this is what I wanted to, again, challenge you on. And it sort of overlaps with the discussion we've having about the true and the good and the beautiful. Because I think there are three different dimensions by which we organize intelligibility. So there's the narrative. The example I use is video games. And there's a reason why people are doing the virtual exodus. They're preferring video games over the real world because of the dimensions that are found in video games. So one is a narrative, and the narrative they belong to. Clearly, that's one of the things. So total agreement with that. But there's two other features that are deeply meaningful to them. Not semantic, but meaning in life meaningful to them. One is a nomological order. There's a set of rules that they understand that makes sense of that world, so that they can move around in that world with confidence. Because if they have a narrative, but it isn't undergirded by an
okay, is that a reflection in the video game of the same through line and mapping of intelligibility onto ontology within the?
That's what I think the nomological.
But it's a simpler world.
Yes.
So they can establish that first.
Exactly.
And so you're saying, okay. So it's a slightly different argument, perhaps, because I said, well, a narrative is a description of an ethic. And you say there's more ways that the world needs to be apprehended than the purely narrative.
Yes.
And I think that's fine. But does that bear on the argument that the description of an ethic is a narrative?
No, because we also describe other ways in which we prioritize our perceptions in things that aren't narratives, that are nomological. That's what we call a scientific theory. The theory of evolution, right, is not a narrative. It's a description of the way things unfold. Or let's say Newton's laws. Newton's laws are not narrative in any fashion. But
do you think? Okay, so let me push back on that. Fair enough. Fair enough. And you could say, well, a set of mathematical axioms and the operations that are derived from the axioms is also not a narrative. And fair enough. So then I would say, and this will get us into discussion about science later, is the intelligibility and the attraction of those non-narrative descriptions of the world dependent on their being nested inside a narrative?
But see, and so here's where I'm going to answer you back. I'm going to say they reciprocally require each other. Just like what we were doing with the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Okay, so okay, fine. So is that the same thing as narrative and the scientific description mutually requiring each other?
Right, but you can't reduce the one to the either to the. You can't reduce one. You can't reduce the nomological to the narrative or the narrative to the nomological. That's what I was trying to get at. 3 dimensions, almost like a Cartesian graph with 3 dimensions. right?
Okay.
You can't reduce, if I remove
Right.
the
Well, because I suppose if you do that too, you run into the postmodern trap, which is that there's nothing but the narrative intelligibility. There's nothing but the narrative.
there has to, yes, and there also has to be something. There has to be a space within which we can compare narratives, move between narratives, and learn narratives, right? And there has to be something that allows us to override narrative bias. You know the research on narrative bias. It's powerful. It's one of our most powerful bias. There has to be something that can kick us out of the narrative bias.
So, but I think the way that the way that I would phrase it is that the reason why we tend to think, or like even the way that I present it, is that the priority of narrative is because narrative is the embodied manner in which we engage with a structure of value. It is, it's the way that we engage in a structure of value. And so because we see and usually it has
is
to
a
be,
narrative that embodied pattern, or is it a description of the embodied pattern?
I think that it's
Because I don't know if it's a story if you act it out. I don't know if it's a story until it's a representation of a pattern of action. Because otherwise it's more like a pattern of behavior, you know? Like, so for example, imagine you watched wolves interacting.
Yeah.
You could say, well, it's as if they're following the following narrative rules. But they're not, because they don't have, it's not narrative, it's a pattern in their behavior.
Right, but for the same reason that it's the through line, like for the same reason that you can't see the glass from the elements of the glass, it doesn't mean that the glassness, like the identity of the glass, has a causal relationship to its elements. It's just not a mechanical causal relationship. It's a causal of identity. And so the narrative, or let's say the pattern of behavior, is causal from above, you could say, because it's the way in which you recognize that the behavior is a pattern in the first place.
Right.
Okay, I want to push back on your
All right, no, you have to. You have to, John.
This is one of the areas where we
kind of don't totally agree.
but that's good, because
Well, this is a real mystery, this problem, because
Yeah,
it is the relationship between science and the narrative of meaning. It's a relationship between ontology and epistemology, or between description and value. I mean, so it's no wonder that this is causing, a little bit of trouble.
So I want to throw in one more dimension, which is you can also level up in a game. There's a way, there's a dimension that's not a narrative. It's an act of self-transcendence, right?
I thought of that as a meta-narrative.
that you can scale in a game. That has to be.
That's Quidditch, by the way. That's what rolling represented with Quidditch, because there's a game and a metagame.
Oh.
And if you win the metagame, you also win the game.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
But not vice versa, which is it's so smart. So, sorry.
You do this, Jordan. You'll just throw out these observations that are like,
It's even worse than that, because the thing
I want to deal with it, but I have to
that
get
the
through this
Quidditch
other
players are chasing is the round chaos of alchemy that